I'm going to show you how to how to sponge paint a scene on a tumbler. So you're going to start out with, as always, a prepped tumbler, and we're going to base paint the tumbler. I'm going to use Custard, the Aurora 3-in-1 paint. I want to use a background color that goes with what I'm choosing. So we're just going to apply this onto our tumbler, and chances are we're going to need 2 or 3 coats doing this. The lighter colors do tend to need more than 1 coat. So we'll apply this, and then we're going to let it dry for half an hour. After we've let it dry, we're putting on our second coat, and we will need a third coat for this particular tumbler. So after it's dried half an hour, it's dry to the touch, I'm going to add a third coat of the same paint, and this way I'm just going to have a nice solid background to use as my base. Once I've got the paint applied and it's all over the entire cup, I'm going to let the tumbler dry for half an hour. So I've started with a pattern that I've cut out in Cricut. So it's the mountains. I've already weeded it and I've added transfer paper. But what I also need is what we're going to use a few times on this tumbler. And we need what's called a mask. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to adhere this to the paper you can use any paper. You want to try to use a thinner paper, not a cardstock, because when you are sponging onto your tumbler, you don't want to have a white line, because if your paper's too thick, you will end up with like a white shadow. So use very thin paper. So I'm just going to cut this out and put it aside, and we'll use this as our mask. I don't want to cut into the vinyl, so I'm just cutting as close to the vinyl as I can. Okay, so there's our mask that we will be using. So now that my tumbler is completely dry, the paint is dry, I'm going to apply my first mask. So what I need to do is determine where I'm going to have my mountains placed on this tumbler. And just for a heads up, I'm going to do the mountains with a sunset and water below the mountains. So I'll just figure out where I want the mountains placed, and then I will tape it in place so that it just stays while I apply my mask. So I'm going to be doing the water portion of the tumbler first. So I'm matching up the mask to the mountains. I want to try to get it as accurate as possible. And then I'll tape down the mask and I will remove the mountains. Okay, so now what I've done is I've got another scrap piece of paper that I know wraps around the full diameter of the tumbler, and I'm just ripping off the edges so that it's not a straight edge. So I'll line up my mountains to where I had placed the first mask, and I just need to do that to find out where to basically start the water line. So I'm going to line this up around the bottom of the mountains. Take off the mountains, and then I'll tape this in place so that it doesn't slip off while I'm doing my first sponge painting. So we have the two masks now solidly in place, and we can start the next step. Now the fun begins. So you need sponge. I just take a round sponge, craft sponge, and then I cut it into 6 to 8 pieces, and I use each wedge for a different color. So I'm going to pour my first color into the cup. I want to work from a cup because it's easier to pick the paint up from a sponge. And yep, use that sponge to wipe off the paint from your fingers and everywhere else it might get. Just as a reference, I always have an inspiration picture that I use when I start any sponge painting. So that's the picture that I'm using. It's not going to look like that, but that's the picture that I've used for my ideas that I'll refer to every now and then. So the first color we're going to use is the chalky white, again from the 3-in-1 Aurora paints. I'm using white because the mountains that I cut out from the Cricut, you will only see the black outlines. So I'm creating basically snow mountains. So by sponge painting it all white, that when I eventually do transfer my decal to the mountains, then the black outlines will define the mountains. So you want to make sure that you're staying within the boundaries of your paper. You don't want to go over that top edge. And you're just going to keep sponging until you've got it covered. So I have let the first coat of white dry for about half an hour, and now I'm going over and I'm sponge painting a second coating so that my white is whiter. So we've made sure that the mountains, the white that we sponged on there, are completely dry, and we're going to remove the masks. We'll still use the top one, but we don't need this bottom one anymore. So I'm going to now the bottom of the mask, I'm going to rip it. I don't like straight edges when I'm painting. And I am not an artist by any means, so I'm totally winging this. Anybody that's an artist is going to do a much better job. But this gives you an idea of how to get the job achieved. So I'm going to line up the mountains to where they were painted white. And as I apply it around, you see, because that I've ripped the edges, that some of the white is showing, and that's okay because that's what I want. I'm going to be sponge painting the water below the mountains, and you don't want like a straight line, a straight edge. So we'll tape that on to secure it in place so that it doesn't move around when we start our next color. So I'm going to use the little duck. It's a really nice little baby blue. And dip the sponge into the paint, and I'm going to start sponging on the beginnings of the water. So I'm just going to go around, make sure that I get everywhere below. You want to be careful again on the mask that you're not going up too high to getting in between those valleys there. So we'll just sponge all this on, and then we'll wait for it to dry for about half an hour. So it's all nice and dry. I've actually put a second coat on off camera. I forgot to record it. So I've got a nice solid blue color. I'm going to remove this mask. Now you can see I've got some touch-ups to do, but we're far from finished, so we're not going to worry too much about any of these. We've got lots of time to do the fixing. I'm just going to raise the mask up a little bit so that I don't have as much fixing to do later. So by moving this up a little bit higher, then the pieces that did not get painted in last time are now exposed. We're going to start adding our second color, so this works out perfect. So for my next step, I'm just going to use some scraps of the paper that I've already used, and I've torn the line, and you'll see here how thin the paper is, and that's important. As I mentioned before, you want to make sure that you don't, first of all, have straight lines, and that your paper is thin so that you don't end up with any shadowing. What I'm going to try to do here is effectively create ripples or waves in the water, just so that it's not all solid color. So I'm just going to use my mask to help me out with that. So I'll just wrap it around the tumbler, place it strategically, just or not so strategically, tape it in place so that it doesn't move when I'm painting. The next color I'm going to use the deep sea blue, and it's a little bit darker than I wanted, so I'm just going to squeeze some paint into my cup, and then I'll add some of the Aurora Chucky White paint as well, and we'll mix that up really good so that we have a lighter blue. Once you have the color that you're going for, then we're going to get ready for our next stage of sponging. All right, so we'll dip the sponge in and we'll start. Now this time I'm not going for a solid finish. I'm just going to sponge around so that you will see some of the light blue in behind. And that's okay, it's what I want. So no solid coverage there at all. Now the parts that I messed up earlier and that I missed, I'm just going to use the same paint, same sponge, and I'm just going to sponge around the base of the mountains. Once I move the mask, you'll see the differences. As I was working on this, I changed my mind and I didn't really need the bottom mask. I would have left the paper mountains there in hindsight, but that's all right. So I'm just going to remove that paper, and then I'm just going to fill in the rest of the water. We'll just keep sponging. And it's good to keep using your sponge until you run out of color, because what it's doing is it's adding layers of color. So when you dip your sponge into the paint, obviously it's darker. The more you sponge, the lighter it gets. But if your paint is too dark, you can just sponge off onto your scrap paper that's on your table there, and then just keep going. And then that way, with the different colors, different textures, you're going to get more dimension and depth. To get more of a water look, I'm going to create like a wave kind of look to the tumbler. There's different ways that you can do this. So if I just take this piece of paper, wrap it around, and you'll see that again, I always emphasize no straight lines. So I've given the paper curves, and I've taped it around the tumbler, and then I'm going to use the deep sea blue this time, and I'm not going to dilute it so that it's a bit of a darker color that we've been using. I'm going to dip in sponge, dab off a little bit, and I'm just going to go along the top edge and sponge along that edge. Sorry it's off screen a little bit, but you'll see as we continue that all I'm doing is just going around some of the top edge. I won't go around the whole perimeter of the tumbler. I'm just going to do it in some spots, and then I'll show you the second way. So we'll remove this paper. I should do it when the paper's dry, but just for this video, I'm taking it off when it's wet and being careful. But you can see here how we've got some different lines, different waves. So I'm going to take off the paper that's got paint on it and just use a scrap. I'm not going to tape it this time, and I want to give it a different curve, like deeper curves. I just don't want the same look all the way around. So I'm just going to hold it in place, and again, I'm going to go in with my sponge and dab along that line and make some more curves that I'm hoping will look like waves when we're done. So if you want, you can take the edge of your sponge instead of using the paper, and then you can just follow along and just add random lines to your tumbler. Again, you're going in curves. You don't want it to be straight. You're just adding random ones. And then I will use my sponge to kind of go over to soften the edges so that they're not so distinct. Just rub the paint off around a little bit, and then you don't have harsh lines. So I think that's probably good for right now. Just touch up a couple little spots. We will be going in and doing a little bit more. Some of it I won't touch up until after I've added, like the sunset or the mountains. After I look at it, I might go in and make some changes. But that's it for right now. So now we're going to get to start applying the sunset to the tumbler. So I'm going to use my mask once again to cover up the mountains. And I'm trying to line up so that there's just a hairline of the white that's left. By doing that, then I'll eliminate as much of the yellow as I can that goes around the mountains. Then we'll tape it in place so that it doesn't move when we're painting. This is the picture that I'm using for inspiration. It's not going to look anything like this, but it's just helping me get an idea of what a sunset might look like. So you remember that we used the custard paint when we started off with our background. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start off with the custard paint again. However, I'm going to add some white to it so that it's lighter than the background color that we did use. Obviously, if I use the same two colors, you're not going to notice any difference. So we'll take the lighter mixed color, and I'm just going to go in the lower valleys of the mountains and just sponge around. I'm going to do it all the way around the tumbler. Not necessarily, you'll see that I'm dabbing on the paper just to give me an idea of a line. But with the mask that we have, there'll be some of the valleys that have more or less of the lighter color. That will make more sense once we remove the mask, but I'm just trying to get an inconsistent look. So once I think I've got enough of the lighter yellow filled in, I'm going to move on to my next color. We're going to start with the lightest color and move to the darkest color. So this time I'm going to use a little bit of the tangerine. So I'll use a new sponge for the tangerine. So now I'm just going to follow along the line I was kind of doing before. I am going right over top of the yellow that I just painted. Now, because it's still wet, these two colors are going to mix together a little bit to create a different color where they line up. Then I'm going to move on to my next color, and I'm going to use poppy red this time. And again, I'm doing it while the paint is still wet, just so that I can mix the colors together a little bit easier. So I'm just going to start going overlap where I did before. I'll just keep dabbing along. What I want to do to soften up, I'm just taking one of the other sponges and I'm going to dab along that straight edge line that you saw, and I'm just dabbing over top of it. So the paint that's already on the brush mixed with the two colors that are on the tumbler, it's helping to soften up that harsh line. And we'll just keep doing that all the way around the tumbler. We'll just add red, and then we'll take one of the other sponges and we'll go along and get rid of those harsh lines, excuse me. So what I had wanted to do but forgot was I wanted to add a sun. So I'm going to look for a place on the tumbler that still has quite a bit of the yellow. And then I've just used a cutout from a post-it note. I've used a punch to punch a circle. And the post-it note has the sticky on it. So it will therefore stick to my tumbler really good. So what I'll do there is I'm just going to sponge around that with we'll use like the orange sponge. And we're just going to kind of dab around. Again, I'm just working on softening the lines, but I'm also at the same time adding different colors to my sponge because it's soaking up some of the colors that I'm going over. Now I'm going to use the yellow and just keep dabbing around. I'm just going over top of other colors. Just again, adding more dimension. So on this here, as I dab, I'm also brushing downwards because it's drawing down some of the paint that was already in there. So that, again, I'm not having any of the harsh lines. um, as I get to the top because I do want the sunset to have different layers to it. But what I want to do for around the sun that I've just done is use a sponge with mixed up with the other colors, and I'm going around that post-it note. So essentially what I'm trying to do is create a haze around the moon. Whether I'm successful or not is another story. Again, I'm not an artist, but I do like to try to create these sunsets, and every time I do it, I do something different. And you'll find that you'll do the same thing. The more you do it and the play with it, the more you'll get to understand how the colors flow together. I'm just going to go over with the other orange just to soften up some of the lighter to add some more layers to it. I'm liking the way it's starting to look right now. I just think I just need to fill in some more of the yellow a little bit, because what I'm going to do is I'm going to add some darkness around the top eventually, but I don't want too much of dark. So I'll just sponge right around it, not doing a solid sponge in look, just dabbing randomly. So I'm going to use a little bit of the licorice now to create that dark look. Now you might want to do something different. You don't have to use licorice paint or the black paint. You could do a dark blue. You could mix your blue and your black together. Be creative when you do these. Make these your own. So I really don't want a hard layer of black. So I'm dabbed it off on the paper quite a bit to get rid of a lot of the paint. And I'm just going around the top to give it a little bit of darkness. I'm just doing it gently and just right around the top edge. Again, I don't want it to be a straight line. The more I dab, the lighter the paint is getting, so I'm able to just go a little bit lower so that it's not as dark. Okay, so we're going to get ready now, and I'm going to take off our mask so you can get an idea of where we are so far. Not looking like a whole lot, but again, you have to have the end result in your mind so you know what you're getting. Now, because I've taken my paper off while the paint's still wet, some of the paper has stuck to it, but that's okay. You can just peel it off. It's not going to be a problem. Now I'll take off the mask where I had the moon. And again, I'm doing it while the paper's wet. So some of the paper is sticking behind, but it also will peel off the paint a little bit as well. So just use your sponge to fix up any areas that you need to. You have all those sponges, the paint is still wet on all of them, so you can just fix anything up that you want. One of the things I do want to fix up is in a couple spots you can see that there's parts of the tumbler showing where the mountains are from taking the mask off when the paint was wet. So all I'm going to do is because it was the white, I'm just going to use a brush and white paint, and I'm going to just paint around to cover up those little pieces just in case the vinyl doesn't cover them up. This way I'm ensuring that everything will be covered up. As I was fixing up the white, I realized that I wanted to add some white caps to the water. So I'm just going to use a Post-it note and tear off an edge so that it has a little bit of a curve again to it, and it has the sticky edge, so I can use that to tape it down to the tumbler. And then I'm just going to use my brush and white paint, and all I'm going to do is just lightly go around the top edge. I'm going to try to follow where some of the other lines were, matching up where I think a white cap would look good. You're not going to need much paint for this. And I just want to apply it softly too. I just want it to be a subtle look. So I'm just going to go around the curved Post-it note. And there you go. And then I'll just find a few other spots along the water's edge and repeat until I'm satisfied. I'm just going to keep using the paint that's on the brush because, again, I just want it to be more of a subtle look. If I need more, I'll put some on the brush, but I'll wipe it off on the paper first. It's easier to apply more than it is to remove. And I'm just going to keep using this same Post-it note to go around. Now the artist part of me that's in my head wants to take it another step further and add birds to the tumbler. And again, it's just showing you what you can do. Again, I can't stress I'm not an artist, but I like to try to achieve different looks, and it's fun. So I'm just going to use a thin brush and some black paint, and I'm just going to practice on the paper first to make sure that the brush that I'm using is thin enough and that I don't have any globs of paint. So I'm just going to use this brush, and all I'm going to do is apply some little V's to make it look like birds. And I'll do this all the way around the tumbler. They'll never be the same size, obviously. They'll be tiny little ones. It'll be a tiny little bit bigger. But I'll just add some birds until I'm satisfied. It's fun to be able to be creative. I find it relaxing. And it's a lot of fun. The next step after we're done is we're going to put it on our turner and add some Hyperion. But I just want to give you a quick look of what we have going on so far. Like if I line up where my decal's going to go with the mountains, you're going to see kind of like the look that we have going on so far. Remember, all the white that's behind this decal isn't going to be showing. All you're going to be seeing is the black of the mountains. So that's where these curved lines in the water line come in handy. After letting the paint dry for 1 hour, we're going to put it on our tumbler and add a flood coat of Hyperion. We'll do that, making sure that we cover the entire tumbler as well as the bottom. And the reason we're adding Hyperion right now before we're completely finished is that when we do go to add our decal, if we need to move our decal for any reason, we're not going to be lifting any of the paint off. All right, so we will leave this dry for 2 hours and then we'll go on to our next step. Now that our tumbler has dried for 2 hours, we're going to get ready for our next step. You can see that it's already got a beautiful shine with just one coat. So we're going to line up where our decal's going to go so that we make sure we're putting it in the right spot. Once we know where it's going, then I like to lift up just a little piece to get it started. So I'll just lift off some of the transfer sheet and then I'll put it back onto the tumbler and we'll start from there. I find it easier to peel off some of the transfer tape and then use my scissors to cut it so that I'm left with just a little bit. And I'll apply that in the right spot. And we're going to line it up to the edge as best as we can. Now when we're going around, we may have to make adjustments, but that's okay. We're just going to line it up and we're going to be following the peaks of the mountain as best we can. And as we go around, I'm just going to see how I've had to actually lift it off. That's where the Hyperion comes in so handy, because if I was lifting that off the paint, it would be peeling the paint off too. So this by far makes it much easier. So I'm just trying to get it lined up. It is a little bit of a process to get started for sure. But we'll line that up, and once we do, then I'll just keep peeling off little pieces as we go of the transfer tape. So just putting a little bit on at a time. I find if it does get off too much, then that's all right. You're just going to cut your mountains. Nobody's going to know, but it just helps you because you really want to try to keep your peaks as lined up as best as you can. So all I did was just cut it to make it easier to apply and to make sure that I'm lining it up in the right spots. I'll just keep going around. And wherever I notice it's not going to line up, then I'm just going to cut into the vinyl and cut it off. It gets a little bit tricky, but the good thing is we're working with these mountains. The white is just the transfer paper that you're seeing, so it's actually just the black. So once you cut this off, we can make adjustments after we've got the mountains completely attached. So what I want to do here is I want to peel off the transfer tape. So I will press down the vinyl really good and I'll peel off whatever vinyl I do have on there so I don't forget that it's there, for one thing. Then by removing the transfer tape, if I have to overlap, I won't be overlapping on the transfer tape itself. So then we're just going to continue applying the mountains. What I should have done is had a holder here so that my tumbler wasn't rolling away on me. So we're just going to peel back some of the tape again like we did before, just a little bit at a time. And we'll continue as we were, trying to line up again. The most important part is the peaks of the mountains.
Okay, so once we have it all completely applied, we'll burnish it down so that the vinyl is sticking to the tumbler. Make sure all the pieces are adhered, and then we'll peel off the last piece of transfer tape. So then we have these little pieces that are lower than they should be. So again, this is where the Hyperion comes in so handy because it's shiny, and this vinyl is going to lift right up, so we can lift up those pieces of vinyl and snip it off. So we'll just fix up all the pieces that we don't want. So once we have it all snipped off where we want, and everything is looking the way we want it, I think it's starting to look pretty fabulous myself. Now, having said that, as I turn around and look at it, I realize that it's missing something. So I've gone to my Cricut machine and I've cut out some little tiny miniature whales and seals. So I'm going to show you two ways to take this further. So you can't see them on here right now, but I'm going to cut each one off so that they're on individual pieces. Now this is only to give you an idea of things you can do because it limits the number of pieces you actually have to cut out, because each marine animal that I actually have two ways to use it. I have this decal right here that I can stick on the tumbler, and I have this piece that I can use as a mask. So I have these done. I'm going to put them aside for just a moment because what I'm going to try to do is add a reflection of that sun. So I've used a punch, and again I'm using a post-it note, and I'm just going to use a very small punch, a circle punch, so that it's smaller, and I'm going to try to line it up so that it's directly below that sun down in the water. So using the adhesive that's already on the post-it note, I'm going to keep it, it'll stick it to the Hyperion. And then I'm going to add some paint, and I'm going to use the custard, the same as I was using originally. And then I'm just going to try to sponge on the sun. So I'm dabbing off because I don't want any globs of paint. I just want to try to do it as gently as possible, not necessarily solid. And then I'll use the edge of my sponge to try to create a reflection line. Now I've added just a little bit more that I want, so I'm just going to use the dry part of my sponge to lift off some of the paint so that it's not quite as vibrant. And then I'll lift off my paper, and there is what is supposed to be my reflection. Now I'm going to show you what to do. We're not all perfect and we make mistakes. I make a lot of them. I'm not quite really liking the way that sun looks because I don't think I've got it at the end of the reflection very good. So I'm going to wipe it off while it's dry. But you'll see how some of it has already started to dry. I'm just going to use a very small amount of rubbing alcohol, and it's going to take that off. And again, because we've used Hyperion, this is perfect because it really does clean up the mess nicely. And then we can go back and we can try a second time to apply our sun. Now it's looking a little bit more centered. All right, so now we're going to try adding our marine life to our water. So I'm just going to lift these off, and I'm going to randomly place it somewhere on my tumbler, like so. Then using the reverse part that I told you about, we're going to apply that somewhere on the tumbler at random. And I'm going to use black paint and my sponge. And I'm going to just gently dab on top of that mask. Now again, for the purpose of this video, I'm not really letting this paint dry, and it should really dry for a few minutes before I lift off this vinyl. But I'm just going to lift it off right now just so that you can see what we're trying to achieve here. It's got a little bit of a rough edge to it. If I had to let it dry, it'd be a little bit more solid, but you get the idea. So that way you don't have to cut out as much of vinyl. You can use, for every one piece you cut out, you've got two that you can use. Okay, so we're just going to go ahead and apply the rest of the pieces that I've cut out. I've done them different. I've done different whales. I don't want them all looking identical. So I've done them a little bit different. And I'll just go ahead and finish applying all of those. This little guy that I'm applying has a water spout, so I'm actually going to need a second color for that. I'm just going to use a blue, just a little bit on the sponge, and I'm going to apply that over top of my water spout. And then I'll do the rest of the whale in blue, in black. So after adding my whales and my little sea lions or seals, I'm going to add just a little tiny bit of white splashes to each of the black vinyl decals. I'm just going to use my brush and just use a little bit of white to add a little bit of splash so it doesn't look like that it's just sitting on top of the water. So I'll do that to all the little pieces. And sorry, I keep going out of frame for this, but I hope you get the idea of what I'm trying to do here. Just want to add a little bit of white to each of the decals. I'll use my sponge to just lightly dab over the white so that it mutes it a little bit, so that it blends in with the water better.